Welcome. Today we are going to stay in Athens and continue our discussion of atheistic systems of beliefs and practices and look at the main rival to Epicureanism, and that is the school of thought known as Stoicism. We're also briefly going to talk about Skepticism, which was a branch out of the Stoic school that briefly held sway over Stoicism in general. But is kind of a subsect of Stoicism and how that moves on. When you think of Stoicism, when you hear Stoic, what is your thought? Some of you think of a cartoon character. Think of the father in the How to Train Your Dragons movie. His name was Stoic. There you go. Stoics, that's what I think. This is the first thought. Others of you will think of the logic of, Star Trek Spock, probably depending on your generation between which of these two characters comes to your mind first, or just the idea of logic permeating if you are familiar with the philosophical system of Stoicism at all. Some of you also just kind of gravitate to the idea that it's some sort of Greek philosophy, and some of you, again, think that maybe this is just a boring system. It's just sitting there and rationalizing everything, and there's no real life in it. But like hedonism, this is a total system for understanding your life. In fact, it started at the same place. It started in Athens. And Stoics define the aim of Stoicism as maintaining a good flow of life, or living in agreement with nature, living in accordance with experience of what happens by nature. Zeno, Cleithus, and Crispus were the three who said these. And so this isn't supposed to be a boring, dry system, but living in the system that exists in nature and the world all around us. Stoics start off with a question that's very similar to Aristotle and his founding of virtue ethics, and that's the question of what is good? What is the good that we're seeking? Aristotle's answer was eudaimonia and flourishing, and this isn't a bad answer, by the way. The Stoics probably just thought it was a little insufficient because it didn't address all of the aspects of life that they were looking for. So, questions we might ask ourselves is what is good? What do we all agree is a good? What's going to help you have a good flow of life or living in agreement with nature? Sometimes being virtuous is going against your natural impulses. In fact, oftentimes it is. And where is the good in between just giving into a natural impulse and fighting against it entirely? Where's that balancing act? What things are goods? We've talked about this before with Epicureanism and others of what is it that we need to survive? Right? These are our goods, philosophically speaking. Some people like to add money to this idea. It's going to help you be happy. Comedian Daniel Tosh even had a little joke about this idea of, money can't buy happiness, but could buy a wave runner, and you look pretty happy on a jet ski. So maybe, right? I mean, this, it's a joke, but it's got a point to it, right? We'd rather be able to buy toys that make us happy as long as those things don't destroy us in the interim. And while a jet ski might make you happy, and we might see a jet ski as good, and other goods, cars, monies, house, physical pleasure, these things are all good, and we like them all. We want more of it in our life and not less, but the Stoics say that whatever is good must benefit its possessor under all circumstances. Your jet ski, if you've got one, is sitting in your side yard or in your garage or in a storage unit. You're not using it right now. Owning it right now might not be any good. And there's even a joke, what are the two happiest days in a boat owner's life? The day he buys his boat and the day he sells his boat. Because it's a lot of work maintaining it, and it doesn't really make you happy the entire time. It makes you a little happy, and it's enjoying buying it, but what goes on beyond that? Stoics kind of even take this a little bit farther of what goods are going to be goods in all cases, at all times, even if you are on fire. What goods would satisfy you if you are on fire? That shrinks that list of things that are good a lot more. Even living a virtuous life may or may not count for that. House, money, boats, cars, even food, shelter, right? All of the basic things aren't going to do you a lot of good if you're on fire. And if they will not endure fire, then what good are they, really? Are they going to be seen as the supreme goods? Physical pleasure at this point, the Stoics point back at the hedonists and say, isn't good enough. Physical pleasure doesn't give you flourishing at this moment. It's not truly good. The Stoics say that the only thing that would matter at this moment is reason. It would let you know that being on fire will not last forever. It might kill you. You might reasonably say, I'm going to die as a result of this, or I will be out of this in a moment, and you can react calmly and address what needs to be addressed. But you'll know through reason that it's not going to last forever. That there's a short time to this pain and suffering, and that there might be a better course of action than flailing out in pain and screaming. Maybe not, who knows. Now, I would probably add into one of these goods something that Stoics haven't really talked about, and that would be notions of friendships and relationships and connections, that might even comfort you during this time. The Stoics say that the only thing that would be reason, but there can probably be a few other objections we could think of at this moment. Reason also tells us, according to the Stoics, that the only things that are good would be the virtues: prudence or wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, and other related qualities to these things. The Stoics advocate, as already kind of hinted at here, that the chief of these is the one that would let you determine which of the others was correct, and that is wisdom. Now notice from our discussion with Epicureanism and Epicurus, his notion was prudence was much more important. Same virtues, same things to aspire after. And here we have the idea of prudence, again, notions of wisdom going to help you out, but it's going to reign supreme instead of just being equal and helping you to get a pleasurable life. This is going to dictate all aspects of life. The founder of Stoicism is a man by the name of Zeno, sometimes identified as Zeno of Cittium or Zeno the Stoic as the founder of Stoicism. He was born in 336 and will die in 265 BC, and he is a Phoenician Greek from the island of Cyprus. Cyprus is a very large island and engaged in trade throughout the Mediterranean, and this is indeed what Zeno and his father were engaged in. They would ferry goods from the Phoenician Greek areas into Athens and elsewhere throughout the Mediterranean. But at the age of 22, he encountered a major obstacle to this when his ship was wrecked. He was outside of Athens, and at this point he will have nothing. There's no insurance. There's no, well, other things could work out for you. He is destitute and alone. He ends up finding a copy of some philosophy manuscripts and ends up getting taught by Stilpo, the Megarian, and reads a lot of Socrates and decides he's going to dedicate himself to philosophy. He'll learn from Stilpo that the greatest fault in life is saying yes too quickly to any request, and one should avoid doing so in order to live a tranquil life. This is the starting point. We need to say no to a lot of things. We're too quick to engage with ideas of saying, yes, I'll do it, yes, I'll do it, and then what do you realize? Oh no, what did I say yes to? That's going to eat up all of my time. That's going to exhaust me. That's going to physically injure me. That's going to cause me strife, etc. The idea from Zeno and from Stilpo is that we need to stop and pause. There's real power in the word no. Or let me think about that. He's not saying say no to everything, but don't say yes too quickly. This is the push. This is one of those starting ideas. Now, Stilpo took Zeno as a student. He didn't say no to everything. Right? There is a balancing act involved with this as well. Also was the idea that one should not try to pursue pleasure itself, as it is always fleeting and you can only possess it briefly. Instead, you should seek wisdom or reason. Once you have achieved this, you will gain a sense of enlightened apathy. This is the goal within Stoicism. It's not just apathy, but an enlightened apathy. Just like you're not going to say no to everything, you're going to reason what you should say yes and what you should say no to. This is the goal. Enlightened apathy, where you will be set free from the enslavement of one's passions, as Zeno taught. He began teaching this in one of the colonnades in Athens. Colonnades in Greek is stoa. Therefore, the idea of Stoicism. It's the school that originated around the stoa, around these colonnades. Universal reason, or the logos, was the greatest good in life, and wisdom is incompatible with error. You cannot be wrong and wise. Now, this might be something we're going to argue with. So this might be something you push back on yourself. But if you spout things that are wrong, you're generally not seen as wise. You're seen as a fool. And so there is this idea growing within Stoicism from the very beginning that wisdom is incompatible with error. If you lived according to instinct, impulse, and passion, Stoicism argues that you are no more than an animal. If you live according to reason, then you are a human and worthy of existence. So this is the basic teachings of Zeno, that we need to seek wisdom. We need to be able to say no to things, not be driven by our animal passions, and gain a sense of enlightened apathy, which will let you truly be happy and flourish. And it's all because of wisdom as the guiding post. Now, Zeno will add in here, of course, that we need to follow those 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, courage, moderation, and justice. These are going to help you live a good, flourishing life, as Aristotle argues. But again, prudence or wisdom is the supreme of these virtues. Not courage, not even moderation, as a lot of people will take Aristotle's notion of the golden mean to indicate. But how do you know what is too much and what is not enough? And justice is never complete, never full. So this leaves prudence, being able to understand where the right decisions are, to be the supreme idea for Stoicism. The next major figure in Stoicism is a man by the name of Epictitis. He lived 50 to 130 AD, and his most famous work is the Enchiridion. In it, he lays out the idea that the individual is wholly responsible for his or her interpretations of circumstance. Good or bad things happen all around you, but it is up to you to interpret that event. You should not let a single event dictate your response. Question that can be posed following this idea is, what do you do when somebody steps on your foot? How do you react? Do you freak out? Do you yell out in anger? Do you punch the person? Do you curse them? Or do you stop and collect yourself and say, this is what has happened, and move on? Do you analyze the experience, understand, is this an innocent mistake or an act of aggression? Did somebody do this maliciously? And then if they did, how should you react to that? If they didn't, how should you react to that as well? The idea of instantaneously reacting negatively as an act of impulse or a fight or flight reference isn't really a good idea. Epictitis would point out that you should not let these moments of distress control your actions and the way that you see the world around you. Now, Epictitis wasn't somebody who had no difficulty in his life and therefore is able to say, just rise above it all. He was born in Hierapolis in Asia Minor, Anatolia, to a slave and therefore was born a slave. He was granted his freedom when he was about 20 years of age, and largely this was in part based upon his intellectual abilities, and he was sent to study Stoic philosophy. He sets up his own school in Rome, and the Romans will embrace his philosophy, especially in relations to his notions of self-control. The Stoic idea of natural law also played an important role in the construction of Roman law, and Epictitis is important in this idea. So many of the legal ideas that are very important for Roman civilization in the late 1st century are also derived from Stoic principles. But when the Emperor Domitian comes into power around 89, he gets banished along with other philosophers. And he then travels to Nicopolis and to Greece and will set up a school there. It is here that he works and develops the work, the Enchiridion, and his dialogues are written at this point as well. And here we have the stress about individual interpretations making an event good or bad, and this is where this idea is fully explained. The strength of what Epictitis says is that the world is happening all around you, and largely we are slaves to one passion or the other, to the dictates of others, as Epictitis was a slave early on in his own life. But what will free us from our captivity, Epictitis would say, is the same thing that freed him from his own captivity, and that is reason. Use your intellect, use your reasoning ability. Don't react to the world, but even when you're a slave, even when you get exiled, produce your greatest work then. Produce when the rest of the world is against you. Don't react to little things. Don't even react to big things. Yes, there's oppression. You might even be oppressed. But Epictitis would say, you're responsible for how you're going to react to that. That is on you, and that is what you can control. And in that way, even if you are in bondage, you will be free. The Stoics will have their own theory of reality that is opposed to what the hedonists believe the universe looks like and what it's constructed with. The first and most obvious difference is that Stoics believe that the universe is finite, that it came into being. And, following teachings of Aristotle and others, there's the argument that the world exists based upon a first cause and matter. This first cause is a God who is a creative fire who animates the world, and various things spawn out of him in cycles as they gradually separate into the 4 principal elements. Fire, not the divine type, water, air, and earth. Eventually, they reduced back into this flame where they came from, and then expand into the universe again in another cycle. And each cycle is identical to the one that came before it. So we have notions of an eternal return, along with almost sort of the Platonic progression added into all of this. So lots of borrowing from different philosophical ideas that is going to help the Stoics understand the nature of their universe. The Stoics argue that nature is rational, providential, and complete. Reason is the only thing that can define what is good. And there's a cosmology which is based upon Plato, with an ethical system that largely is derived from Aristotle. This includes that the essence of reality is also material. It's not just in the ideas, but does exist around us. The Stoics also advocate that nothing happens without a cause. This connects the idea of the events found from the noumena, or the spirit, acting in matter. Probably the most important advantage that the Stoics have is the argument that nothing falls outside the mind's control is good or bad. It simply is. The thing that's going to make an event good or bad is not something intrinsic to that object, but is how we relate to it. Do we like it or do we not? Are we going to let it dictate us or not? In fact, the same event can happen to you multiple times, and you might see it, one is good and the other is bad and the other is neutral because of the way you want to approach it. So again, nothing, according to the Stoics, falls outside of this mind is good or bad. The world around us simply is. To be happy, people must fulfill our function as social animals and accept the perfection of reason as the standard of goodness. And with this, we will continue to develop those virtues of prudence, courage, moderation, and justice as the ways to excel in our own lives. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 and will die in 180. He's often identified as the last of the good emperors of Rome. That's usually just shorthand for the last of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. He is the father of Commodus, who was a bad emperor, but did not kill his father, as we see in the movie Gladiator. It was a good movie, not quite historically accurate in that way. Ridley Scott isn't really known for his historical accuracy. Usually his works are rather biased but entertaining. Aurelius will reign as emperor from 161 to 180. And while we might think of him as a Stoic and therefore rising above it all, his reign is characterized by constant warfare and the persecution of Christianity. He launched a persecution of Christianity from 162, roughly the very beginning of his reign as emperor, to 166. He saw Christianity as disrupting the social order because they refused to honor the state religion. And Marcus Aurelius believed that that caused tension, and therefore they should just simply go away. And he thought the same thing about all of the warfare that was all around him. As we'll read in his Meditations, this wasn't really his ideal situation, but this is the situation that he found himself in. From a very young man, Marcus Aurelius was groomed to be the next emperor. He was well connected to the powers that be, and his family was going to make sure that he moved the right directions to become a skilled politician. His training in philosophy as a young man was in the skills of a politician, oratory and rhetoric, knowing how to speak and how to spin, which is really not that terribly different than the basic skills of politicians today. The problem for the young Marcus Aurelius is that his teachers assigned him reading of the Cynics. And reading the Cynics, he ended up adopting a cynic approach to life. Eating simple and coarse food, having few possessions, and neglect of basic hygiene. As an early teenager, he thrived on being gross and simple, as it were. Most likely, his mother, who was grooming him the best she could to become the next emperor, told him to do more with his life and got him engaged in wider pursuits and, of course, got him new teachers. His new teachers were also politically connected, and partly due to their influence, the Emperor Hadrian adopted Aurelius as his son in 136 at the age of 15. So not only is he being brought up in a way that is going to let him become a politician, but as a teenager, he's now connected to the emperor. He is now a legitimate heir to the powers on the throne. Marcus Aurelius, while an heir, was not the appointed successor. This belonged to another man. But Aurelius was betrothed to that person's daughter. So he's by marriage also connected. So as a young man, he should be the following heir. The legitimate heir was also married to Aurelius's aunt. So however this whole thing is supposed to mix out, he was having all of the connections and everything along these lines and should be set up to be the next emperor after Hadrian. The problem is that Hadrian dies too young, and Commodus, the person who is supposed to be Hadrian's heir, also dies too early. Aurelius can't gain the throne at this point, so Antonius Pius ends up getting the throne. Still, Aurelius is well connected and is named the son, even though he's not, of Antonius Pius, making him a legitimate heir, and he will briefly share the throne with Antonius Pius's other son and heir. So pretty much from the age of 15 until he becomes the emperor at the age of 40, he's being groomed and he's in the household of the emperors and he's being trained by the emperors. He's also, at this point, learning more philosophy from Quintus Julianus Rusticus, who introduces Aurelius to the philosophy of Epictitis and Stoicism even more. It is here that Aurelius gets to see the connections of what it is to be a Stoic and what it is to be an emperor, and puts these things together. Very long training, philosophically and otherwise, very well connected. And it allows for Marcus Aurelius to have every sort of requisite skill one would want to be as the emperor. Yet still, his reign is characterized by warfare and persecution. We read and understand more about the inner thoughts of Marcus Aurelius because of the work that he kept, his journal called the Meditations. While many will approach the Meditations as its own work or as a treatise upon Stoicism, it really was his private journal, and it spelled out all of the principles of Stoicism and the conflict that Marcus Aurelius had with it as well. That he was trying to find peace in a world that's constantly making it difficult. And in this work, he argues that everything that happens in life is natural. You decide what to do with it. And we see an elevation of the works here of Epictitis as well. You are stuck. Life is going to happen. You decide what to make of it. There's an analogy he gives, and I'll update it here for the 21st century. It's saying that you're tied to a truck that's going down the road. You're on a tether, the truck is going. What do you do? Marcus Aurelius says that there's only two things you can do. You can decide to run following the truck as the truck is moving down the road. And while this is difficult and exhausting, it's something you can do. Or your choice is to be dragged as the cart or truck, depending on the century we're wanting to make this analogy out of, is heading down the road. If you're dragged, you're eventually going to succumb. That might be the case if you run as well, that you might trip and make errors. But what do you do with the events of life as they carry you by? You can fight against them, or you can run with them. This is our options. This is the only thing that we can do. On death, he writes, fear of death is fear of what we may experience. Nothing at all or something quite new. But if we experience nothing, we can experience nothing bad. And if our experiences change, then our existence changes with it. Change, but not cease. So this is his quick introduction to the idea of death. Comparing this with Epicurus, it's not saying that death is nothing to you, but death is nothing that you know about. If it's different, then it's different. And if it's not, then why are you worried about it? In Book 4 of the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius explains a little bit more about how we are to see and work and relate with the wider world. He says, our inward power, when it obeys nature, reacts to events by accommodating itself to what it faces, or to what is possible. It needs no specific material. It pursues its own aims and circumstances as they allow, and it turns obstacles into fuel. The basic starting point on how we work and relate to nature around us is by looking at the obstacles that we have. And we have a choice. We can imagine the possibilities that exist around us. We can let it destroy us when we hit an obstacle, or we can turn that obstacle into fuel. Many of you may or may not be familiar with the story of WD-40 and why it's called WD-40. It's because it's the 40th version of this formula. Water displacement 40th formula was the full name of WD-40. In 1953, a startup company called Rocket Chemical Company was commissioned with creating a material that will protect the outer skin of the Atlas missile from rust and corrosion. The rather small staff of 3 set out to create a line of rust prevention solvents and degreasers. It took them 40 tries before they came up with something that worked. And now it's a product that is found in 4 out of 5 American households. Officially, it has over 2,000 uses and many unofficial uses that you can go to the WD-40 website and read about, including one account of a man who sprayed it on himself to try to hide the perfume of his girlfriend so that way his other girlfriend wouldn't find out. Not probably the official use, but you know, hey, there's that distinctive smell to WD-40. Right? There is this idea of turning obstacles into fuel, of knowing that something is possible and continuing to work on that. Now, Marcus Aurelius is not telling you to be deluded. He's not trying to say that you indeed are going to be a star and the rest of the world just needs to accept it. As we saw delusional people, you know, trying out for American Idol and many other singing and other sorts of competitions. This isn't what he's talking about. If you don't have the skills, you should approach the universe as it is, that you don't have the skills. Don't be deluded. But if you know it's possible and you're trying to perfect something, use those obstacles as fuel. It continues that people try to get away from it all, try to escape from reality in many ways, go off to the country, to the beach, to the mountains. You always wish that you can do it too, he says, right? Try to get away from all. He says this is idiotic. You can get away from it anytime you like. You can get away from all of the stresses of the world. Where? He says nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than going within your soul. Escape in your mind. Retreat from the rest of the world and find solace in yourself. This is the technique that he gives. This is what we read in the Meditations, which is essentially him doing this. It's his practice on here. If we do that, we're going to be given the opportunity to renew ourselves. He says, but when we renew ourselves, we need to keep it brief and basic. A quick visit should be enough to ward off all and send you back ready to face what awaits you. What, after all, is there to complain about? People's misbehavior? Then take this into consideration, he says, that rational beings exist for one another, that doing what is right sometimes requires patience, that no one does the wrong thing deliberately. We may disagree with him on that, but this is what he's arguing. And the number of people who have feuded and envied and hated and fought and died and have been buried. In other words, everyone before you has gone through these same sort of troubles. We're all made for relationships with each other, and yet around us is where we're finding fights and complaints. Keep your mouth shut and your mind calm. Don't let everyone around you who will shortly be dead and gone disturb you. Renew yourself regardless of what they're doing. In this, we need to be straightforward and to move ahead. Look at things, he says, like a man, like a human being, like a citizen, like a mortal. And among the things you turn to, these two, that things have no hold on the soul. They stand there unmoving outside of it. Disturbances only come from within, from your own perceptions. Again, we get this Stoic argument that everything around you is neutral. Nothing is good or bad. It's how you approach it. And that everything you see will soon alter and cease to exist. Again, think of how many changes you've already seen. The world is nothing but change, and our life is only perception. This is also going to approach how we should see what can harm us. He says, nothing that goes on in anyone else's mind can harm you, nor can the shifts and changes in the world around you. Then where is harm to be found? If nothing around you can actually harm you, what can harm you? It is your capacity to see it. Stop doing that, and everything else will be fine. Don't be offended. Choose not to be harmed, and you won't be harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been. This is his idea on how we should approach the obstacles in our life. Don't be offended at the craziness around you. Don't catastrophize small events. Approach them as they are, neutral. Choose not to be harmed and it won't harm you. Rise above it. Let the part of you that makes the judgment keep quiet, even if the body is attached to it, stabbed or burnt, or stinking, he says, with pus or consumed by cancer. All of these horrible things. Or to put it in another way, it needs to realize that what happens to everyone, bad and good alike, is neither good nor bad. That what happens in every life, lived naturally or not, is neither natural nor unnatural. There is nothing bad in undergoing change or good that can come from emerging from it. Another way of looking at this, right? The world around us, the haters are going to hate. Move on past that. Don't give them strength. Don't make it bad. Accept the world as neutral around you and thrive and flourish in this way. Aurelius tells us that the first step is not to be anxious, that nature controls it all. Before long, you'll be no one, nowhere, like Hadrian, like Augustus. Remember, this is his private journal, and he's an emperor, and he's comparing himself to other great emperors, but they're dead by the time of Aurelius. That whatever happens around him isn't going to make any difference. That he too will be dead before too long. The second step, he says, is that we need to concentrate on what we have to do, to fix our eyes upon our tasks, our life, what we have to do. Remind yourself that your task is to be a good human being, Remind yourself what nature demands of people. Then do it without hesitation and speak the truth as you see it, but with kindness, with humility, and without hypocrisy. Keep your eye on your task and remember what is true. Look for the truth while you're trying to understand everything around you. Remember that nature's job is to shift things elsewhere and to transform them, to pick them up and move them here and there, constant alteration, but not to worry. Change, but not worry. There's nothing new. Nothing new here. Everything is familiar. Everything is the same as it has been forever. Even though we might have changes and advances, it's really not anything new. It says even the proportions are unchanged. We have new tech, new gadgets, new gizmos, new challenges, but the challenges have their root in old things as well. Nature changes, but are we going to change with it or not? Things fulfill their purposes. You shouldn't be surprised when a fig tree produces figs, nor the world when it produces what it does. A good doctor isn't surprised when his patients have fever, or a helmsman when the wind blows against him. This is what it is. This is what life is. It's figs and wind and fevers. It's things that are natural, that come about. Remember that to change your mind and to accept correction are free acts too. The action is yours based on your own will and your own decision and your own mind. You can change your mind when the world changes around you. When the barren tree now has figs, when the wind comes, when the fever breaks. Change how you approach it. Change your mind in this way as well. Remember that everything is here for a purpose. From horses to vine shoots. What's surprising about that? Even the sun will tell you, I have a purpose, he says, and the other gods as well. And why were you born? What's your purpose? For pleasure? He asks, will that stand up to questioning? If you think your life is for pleasure, does that seem to make sense? Is that the fruit that is supposed to be born out of your life? This is the Stoic challenge to, obviously, to hedonism in general, but it's also a good question for you to ask yourself. Why were you born? This is the question that people like Kierkegaard ask. Why am I born? What is my purpose? What am I supposed to do? This is a question that we should all ask ourselves all the time. What is our purpose? And then change our mind to fulfill that, to produce what we're supposed to produce and do what we're supposed to do. Joy for humans, he says, lies in human actions. Human actions, kindness to others, contempt for the senses, the interrogation of appearances, observation of nature and the events of nature, right? That this is what our joy is found in. Our joy is found in relationships that we have with things. There's three primary relationships we have, according to Marcus Aurelius. The first is with our body. Your mind, soul, whatever you'd like to call it, and your body, they relate to one another. One will influence and push the other. You have needs and urges and desires, pains and afflictions and joys and pleasures within your body that affect your mind, your soul, your spirit. Make sure you have a harmonious relationship and they're not always at odds. It's harder said than done, but that's the first step. The second is with the divine, the cause of everything in all. Look to your God. Are you at peace with your God? Look at the reasons why you would be or not, according to Marcus Aurelius, right? This is the cause. Is it just a first cause, or is there a return? Is there something that God asks of you? And if so, are you doing it? Kind of challenging questions, but worth asking. And finally, it's with the people around you. You're surrounded by people. Are you doing what you need to be doing with them? Do you have good relationships with them? Are some of them, at enmity with you? Do some of them hate you? Why? Do you hate some of them? Can you forgive? Can you forget? Can you move on? Maybe. Maybe it's good to. I don't know. Well, look at that. Think about that. Think about, are you finding joy in your body with your God and with the people around you? Because your joy is to be found in these relationships, according to Stoicism. Stoicism is not an ideology of just grim determination of the world's gonna, hurt you, and it's a way to keep the stiff upper lip and carry on. It's not a let's die to all emotions, but it's a let's find what's worth finding joy in and find joy in that. And Marcus Aurelius points out that it's with your body, with your God, and with those people around you. That you are the one who decides these things is also central to Stoicism. It says either pain affects the body, which is the body's problem, or it affects the soul. But the soul can choose not to be affected, preserving its own serenity, its own tranquility. All of our decisions, urges, desires, aversions lie within. No evil can touch them. To erase false perceptions, tell yourself, I have it in me to keep my soul from evil, lust, and all confusion. To see things as they are and to treat them as they deserve. Don't overlook this innate ability that you have. Look at things as they are, which means sometimes look upon the stench of decay, rotting meat in a bag. Look at it clearly if you can. Look at the things that are ugly as well. And know what it is, what makes it ugly. Is the smell putrid, like with rotting citrus, that weird chemically smell? Is it physically just disturbing? Look at it, know what it is, know why it is disturbing. But you're the one who decides it's disturbing. It's just sitting there, that rotting meat in the bag, or that old, orange on the counter. It's there. You decide what you're doing with it. Stop perceiving the pain you imagine, and you will remain completely unaffected. Your logos, your spirit, your soul, right? And you might reply, I'm not just logos. Fine then. Just don't let the logos be injured. Don't injure your soul because of the body. If anything else is, let it decide that for its own sake. What do we do with issues of remorse then? Why would we be remorseful of things? He says remorse is annoyance at yourself for having passed up something that's to your benefit. But if it's to your benefit, then it must be good. Something a truly good person would be concerned about. But no truly good person would feel remorse for passing up pleasure. So it's not just about what's pleasurable and giving that up, right? So that can't be to your benefit or good. Do you make bad decisions? Fine. You're human. We all make mistakes. Move on. We can't let remorse dictate what we do. We need to give ourselves a gift, as he says in 44. We need to find our joy. He says, people find pleasure in different ways. I find it in keeping my mind clear, in not turning away from the people or the things that happen to them, in accepting and welcoming everything I see and treating each thing as it deserves. Take these things around us. Let us take them as gifts. Give yourself also another gift, that of the present moment, right? This is a gift to you, from you. This moment is what you have. This is what you can know. It says, people out of posthumous fame forget that generations to come will be just the same annoying people that they know now. Everyone around you in the future and the past, people are the same. They bother you. They annoy you. They're just as mortal. What does it matter if they say something about you or what they think? If the cucumber is bitter, he says, throw it out. If there are brambles in the path, go around them. That's all you need to know. Take the joy that you can. Take the present of the very moment you're in. That's what you need to do. Don't look to fame as somehow the solution to your mortality either. A few years ago, there was a study asking young people what they wanted to be when they grew up. And the answer was famous. Famous. Not a job, not an occupation. Fame was what they wanted. Aurelius says that people who are excited about posthumous fame forget that the people who remember them will die too. So everyone knows your name. That's great. They're all going to die too. It's going to pass. Fame isn't going to end mortality for you. Fame is also not a worthwhile goal according to Stoicism. Fame is something that's external, not internal. Fame is something you put on to something else. It's not something you have. Other people look upon you and say, you're famous. You don't have that as a quality. As an example, some of you, if the Pope walked into your home and said, I'm giving you an award for being a fantastic Catholic. You did a great job this year. Keep on going. Some of you, this would be like groundbreaking event. You're letting your parents know, right? This is obviously, you got to call grandparents. This is going to be talked about for decades to come. You're going to hold the little, defender of the faith or whatever certificate he gives you your entire life and pass it down as a valuable family heirloom. Others of you go, I'm not even Catholic. That's odd. Whatever. That was a weird day. And it's not monumental. It's not groundbreaking. It's not anything all that important. It's a funny story maybe, but it's not a, I can barely stand. Right? You make somebody else famous. You give them value. If Billie Eilish or BTS announced a concert on campus, some people would lose it for one or for both, or right? Freak out. I can't believe it. It's so amazing. Other people wouldn't even walk down to the other end of campus if that's where it was. You go, what is that? Oh, okay. Can they be quiet? I'm trying to study here. This isn't that important to me. Right? You'd treat it no different than you would if REO Speedwagon said that they were going to have a concert on campus, or their comeback tour was going to be held in the middle of the stadium. Like, who? What? I guess I'd see it maybe at the county fair if you're there and I'm there at the same time. You had some hits like back in the day. But you're not going to lose it. Your parents might. Maybe not even them. Right? Fame is something that lasts and then goes away. It's fleeting. It's put on other people. And when those people have moved on, you're no longer famous. That has no other value. It's not anything internal. It's all external. So what is it you should do? If fame is not a solution, how should you move and approach life? You need to be beautiful, not just externally, but you need to make your life beautiful. Beautiful things, he says, of any kind are beautiful in themselves and sufficient to themselves. Praise is extraneous. Fame is extraneous. The object of praise remains what it was, no better and no worse. Beauty is different than fame. Things possess beauty. You want to be beautiful, not famous. This is the only solution against death, is to live a beautiful life. Death, he says, is something like birth. It's a natural mystery. Elements that split and recombine. Not an embarrassing thing, not an offense to reason or our nature. Suppose, he says, that a god announced that you are going to die tomorrow or the day after. Unless you are a complete coward, he says, you wouldn't kick up a fuss about which day it was. What difference could it make? you're going to die tomorrow or the day after or 20 years from now or 50 years from now, what difference does it make? Recognize, he says, that the difference between years and now and tomorrow is just as small. It's just moments that will come and go. You need to be prepared for it one way or the other. It's right there around the corner. Don't let yourself forget about how many doctors have died after furrowing their brows over how many deathbeds. In short, know this: human life is brief and trivial. Yesterday a blob of semen, tomorrow embalming fluid and ash. A little bit graphic. It says to pass through this brief life as nature demands, to give it up without complaint, like an olive that ripens and falls, praising its mother, thanking the tree that it grew on. To be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. It stands unmoved by the raging of the sea, falls still around it. Right? The sea can be going crazy all around it, but the rock is still there. That's what our life should be. It's brief, it's trivial, but we can do something with it. Our lifetime is so brief, he says, and to live it out in these circumstances among these people in this body, this is what you have, this little bit of time, and I'm this. Can't be more or less or whatever. He says it's nothing to get excited about. Consider the abyss of time past, the infinite future. 3 days of life or 3 generations. What's the difference? Right? That we need not to fear death. It says fear of death is fear of what we may experience. Nothing at all or something quite new. Again, if we experience nothing, we can experience nothing bad. And if our experience changes, then our existence of this change too. Change but not cease. This is, once again, his attitude towards death. Things happen, there's change. Your life is brief and trivial. Accept the change when it happens. Realize that during this life, people exist for one another. That you can instruct or endure them. Right? That we are social creatures, that we need people, that while we will die and our life is trivial and short, that we are also in existence for one another, and that this is the life that we should have. This is the pursuits that we should be engaged in. The term skeptic comes from the Greek word skeptikos, which means an inquirer. And it ends up developing as its own parallel branch, and by the early 3rd century AD becomes a dominant force in how a Stoic should look and approach the world around them as well. The real founder of skepticism is a man by the name of Pyro. He lived 360 to 270 BC. You'll notice that this isn't too terribly much later than the life and impact of Zeno. Zeno was 336 to 265 BC. They would have likely known each other, and their philosophies would have engaged with one another, and Pyro would have gained from the work of Zeno and what the idea of wisdom would be. Indeed, this is why these philosophical schools are really two sides of the same coin. There's a lot of different stories that emerge about Pyro, and we're not sure if all of them are accurate. One version of the story says that he went with Alexander the Great to India, and here he was influenced by Indian skeptics, quote, naked wise men, usually identified as Hindu Brahmins, but more likely probably Jains. Now, it's also very much possible that this was an account that was made up later to hinder or help his reputation, depending on the audience. In any case, Pyro ends up posing some questions of anybody. It says, if you want to be happy, you have to consider 3 questions. The first is, how are things by their natures? How are things? What attitude should we adopt towards them? And finally, what will the outcome be for those who have this attitude? No, he thankfully doesn't just ask these questions, but he gives us the answer. We could agree or disagree with them, but he gives it to us. To the first, he says that nature is indeterminable. Humans have no access to truth, so the best thing to do is to refrain from judgment. Now notice this is against basic Stoic cosmology as well. Right, that said the universe is knowable, but Pyro says, maybe not, a little more indeterminable. No, shouldn't be too certain. As such, the attitude we should have towards things is that they both are and are not. Right? That we should refrain from saying anything beyond this, that refrain from any assertion is then going to be freedom from disturbance. That's all we can say, is that things are and are not. And the more I want to say things are one way or are not one way, the more disturbed my own soul and my own life will be. And finally, he says that if we adopt this as an attitude, if you internalize this attitude, you will be free from the anxieties that trouble everyone else. The best way to do this, he says, is to limit attachments or beliefs. Right? Cut off attachments, cut off beliefs, and then you'll be free from them. You will not be in error. Into the 2nd century BC, we have a man by the name of Arcesilaus, who maintained that if wisdom is incompatible with error, this basic teaching of Stoicism, then as Stoics will maintain that the best thing to do is to abandon all judgments. That this is what we need to do. We need to abandon all judgments, because any of our judgments are likely to be in error. Then you'll be free from the anxieties that trouble everyone else. Around the year 200 AD or so, there was a new rise in the interest of what Pyro and the earlier skeptics did. A new school of thought will emerge, and these people will be known as neo-Pyrists or new skeptics. The main leader of this was somebody by the name of Sextus Empiricus. And he says that if we are to live a normal life, it means that we must subscribe to a fourfold rule. Right? The way our normal life should be should follow this basic sort of understanding. He says that we have thoughts and feelings, which means we need to accept guidance from nature. That we need to eat when we are hungry and drink when we are thirsty, or constrain our desires. Right? Don't just eat to eat. Right? If you're not hungry, don't eat. If you're not thirsty, don't drink. What are your desires? If they're not in line with where things are, don't do them. Right? This is the second of these. We need to accept the laws and religious practices. In other words, you're a part of a society with social tradition and social ideas. Be a part of that. That doesn't mean that you're going to hold them all as true, but it's how you need to operate. Because to refuse society is not necessarily accurate either. There's value in what the generations before you have said, even if they might be wrong. And finally, that we need to engage in creative activities, right? There must be instructions in the arts that you need a creative outlet for your life, and you need to be engaged in producing something. That we need to limit our mental life to the appearances. It says you do not need to make statements about things being naturally good or bad, existing in this way or that way, but rather try to think of cure to all of those ungrounded doctrines, right? If you can think of a cure, if there's a cure that exists to a doctrine that doesn't have any real reason to it, then fix that. Don't reject all systems, but question them, right? And this is much more the idea that we have about a skeptic, right? An inquirer, somebody who's looking, somebody who's questioning something, not just rejecting everything, but asking, okay, if this is true, then why? And what should we do with it? Skepticism will grow and dominate the Stoic academy as well. The academy will grow from Stoics, but is for a while run by skeptics. As earlier mentioned, it was once said that if wisdom was incompatible with error, the best thing to do would be to refrain from all judgments. And the third head of the academy for the Stoics, a guy by the name of Crispus, 280 to 207 BC, expanded logic and advocated for the suspension on judgment. And this happened even more under Carneades, 214 to 129 BC. Carneades said that we have no notion of real truth, but only apparent truth and apparent falsehood. We cannot be objectively certain of things, but only have a convincing appearance of truth. This ends the control, as Stoics then attack those who think what cannot be known. It was also very important for skeptics to not be wrong. And this is the notion that's being advocated here. We don't want to be wrong, so we're going to hedge our bets. We're going to say that something has the appearance of truth, because it does. It might be false, but it has the appearance of truth. So we're going to operate off of this way. Skeptics are not going to destroy everything, but they're going to test it. They're going to poke. They're going to prod. Again, following that Greek term skeptikos, they're going to inquire and look. And this becomes the central idea of skeptics as the other side of the coin to Stoicism. So now we need to ask ourselves, what has this ethical system told us about the world around us? What has it told us about what is ethical? The answer is to honor the logos. Now, where is the logos? How do you dictate that? It needs more reading, but that's what's going to decide what's ethical, according to the Stoics. What constitutes a good life, according to the Stoics? Using your brain, right? Using your mind, flourishing, not in error, but in retrospection and thinking and deciding, is this worth doing? Is this a smart idea? Is there value in pursuing this as an end? Is there value in thinking and concerning my mind on this? Is this something that troubles my mind or my body? What can reason do to dictate that? What are the passions as addressed within Stoicism? And how do you overcome them? Think about these as you move forward. Also, why you should even overcome the passions is wrapped up within this. We're asked, how could succumbing to the passions reduce the meaningfulness of life? This is one of the things that Stoicism wants you to do, is have a meaningful life. And where do the passions cause problems with this? How does it reduce you to an animal instead of a person, as addressed earlier? Is this ethical system of Stoicism a religion? What qualities does it contain? Obviously, it talks about birth, life, death, and how to live your entire life. Is there something that else is missing? There's gods, cosmology, etc. And we'll even give you a little bonus on that here in a moment, and comparing it with Epicureanism and understanding how they see the cosmos in its entirety. What qualities does it seem to lack? Is there something that is really important for your definition of religion that we don't see here? Is it essentially a religious system, or is it not? These should be questions that you're asking yourself. The Epicureans and Stoics will view reality very different. Even though both are pursuing this idea of being happy, one uses notions of pleasure within reason, and one uses reason, which they find pleasurable. And so you might say they're kind of two sides of the same coin, but if we actually dive into their philosophies more, we're going to understand that they view the world and the universe around them very differently. While both systems were created at the same time, following Aristotle and are being formed by about 80 BC. Both are grounded in Athenian life and should be understood as philosophies of life. Both were also extremely influential until about the late 2nd century, before the growth and primacy of Neoplatonism and Christianity. The basic nature of the universe looks different. For Epicurus, the universe is infinite. For the Stoics, it's finite. For Epicurus, there is multiple worlds that exist, while for the Stoics, there's only one world, our world. While for Epicurus, there are gods, but they don't care about you, and such they're really impotent. For the Stoics, we have God as a prime mover to which moves everything out and brings everything back in. Nature is seen as irrational or random for Epicureans, and therefore trying to approach it all reasonably doesn't work. And the Stoics view the nature of reality as rational. The world around us is ordered and rational, coming from this prime mover. Epicurus was disengaged in politics, while Stoics are radically engaged in politics, including formation of Roman law, and Roman emperors will adopt Stoicism as a practice for navigating the world around them. Finally, it's what is that prime good? Is it happiness, as Epicurus says, or is it reason that we need to hold on to as the prime good? This is just a very quick list of the sorts of differences that exist between Stoics and Epicureans, and you might find in some ways that you agree with a little bit of this and a little bit of that from one side of the aisle and from the other, but this is a basic way that they see things differently.